Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/pro revenge. In today's episode, X yelled had a temper tantrum about child support at his job and blamed me in court for it. The next time I had to go to his work, he regretted it. Besting a travel insurer. Escalating feud leads to dad orchestrating his brother's arrest. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So let's get started. X yelled had a temper tantrum about child support at his job and blamed me in court for it. The next time I had to go to his work, he regretted it. My friend said to post this here. My ex is an abusive pile of shit, and we had a kid together. I left him while I was pregnant, but I would take the baby to see him on his lunch hour occasionally. He paid $29 US a month in child support for a very long time. I got it reviewed when he got that job, and it went to $89 US a month. When he found out how much it went up, he threw a screaming temper tantrum in his work, and chased me out of the building with our 9-month-old. We had family court a few days later, and he blamed me for everything. He even got his friend to lie and say he was there, and I started it. The judge thankfully didn't believe him, but I was told to continue these terrible visits at his work. Now for the revenge. It was a furniture rental store, and he would constantly bad-mouth customers in very detailed ways. The next, and last time I took our baby there, I sat down with a small notepad and wrote down the names he and the other person said, how many months they said they were behind, how much they said owed, and every name he and his buddy called every single person. There were quite a few racial slurs said that day. When time was up, he had to leave, and I told his boss. The boss didn't do a damn thing. I knew 3 people he was badmouthing, and I knew how to get in touch with 5 or so others. I worked my way through that list, telling people exactly how their personal financial info was being released, and the names they were called. He and his buddy lost their jobs the next day, and the owner filed a restraining order against them. I didn't feel bad at all. Besting a travel insurer. In 2013, my dad passed away while my brother and I were on our own independent international adventures. I was in Spain and my brother was in Canada, and we needed to get back to Australia. My travel insurance was dodgy, but eventually paid out after a few complaints, which is pretty standard practice. My brother tried to claim $9,000. He could only get one emergency seat on a bunch of connecting flights, and with that and his flight back after the funeral etc., and other cancellations, it all added up. Shock horror, his claim was rejected. Back then, there wasn't an industry body that dealt with travel insurance companies, or if there was, we had no idea what it was. So my bro went through the usual hurdles involved with the appeals and complaints process. Eventually they told him that his claim for $9,326 was rejected, and their determination was final. So, back then companies didn't really have Twitter handles, especially not insurance companies. So my bro, Ever the Troll, created a Twitter handle in this insurance company's name, complete with their official logo. He quickly set about gaining thousands of followers and legitimately began answering their questions with truthful, albeit quite negative, responses. Things like, "Cue my daughter and I want to travel to Paris. What insurance cover would you recommend? We would recommend you take the premium for our comprehensive cover and burn it. We don't like to pay out on for any insurable event, because it upsets our shareholders. Have fun in Paris," etc., etc. The insurance company got wind of this and sent him a cease and desist letter. My brother counteroffered with a contract for the company to purchase the Twitter account and 2,500 potential customers for the very reasonable price of $9,326. They agreed. Escalating feud leads to dad orchestrating his brother's arrest. My uncle has always been a self-righteous, petty slime ball, with a foul temper and grandiose idea of his own importance but little to no brains. My dad always just took it and tried to keep the peace because family is so important to him. This is the story of how my uncle finally pushed my dad too far and ended up getting arrested for his trouble. It is pretty long since it covers several months of a feud between them. As background, my dad and my uncle are neighbors in a rural community of 600-ish people. My dad built the house my uncle lives in and sold it along with a small plot, so my dad's remaining land is about 6 acres and runs along the side and the back of my uncle's smaller property. My uncle is a dealer for HVAC units. My dad is in the HVAC business and would buy some things from his brother, even though his brother's prices were higher and he had a more limited inventory than other dealers, in order to help his brother out. My dad also rented a building his brother owned and used it as his shop/office. He only rented the building and parking lot, but in the field out behind the shop my uncle and my dad both would collect old HVAC units. These things are rusty and all around fugly, but when they didn't have anything else to do they could go get one of these old units to break down for scrap. This story starts when one day my dad went to his brother and said he needed a certain unit, but his brother quoted him a really high price and also couldn't deliver in the time frame my dad needed. So my dad called up another dealer he works with, and that guy had a unit on hand to give him for a much lower price. A no-brainer. My uncle found out about this somehow. Dudes in the HVAC business are apparently like gossipy teenaged girls, and confronted my dad, basically giving him an ultimatum that if my dad wouldn't commit to buying 100% of his units from my uncle, then my uncle wouldn't sell him anything. I already told you my uncle is an idiot. So my dad didn't say anything to his brother, but he took him at his word and stopped buying anything from him. A month or so later my uncle showed up at my dad's shop and confronted him again, wanting to know why my dad hadn't ordered anything from him that month. When my dad told him why, my uncle exploded. They apparently had a screaming match, and in the end my uncle announced that my dad was no longer his brother, they were no longer doing business together, and my dad was evicted from the shop. I will note that legally my dad was not evicted because evicting him would have required a legal notice, a certain period of time, etc. But my dad was over it, so he said fine and began converting the barn at his house into his new shop. So my uncle, who apparently had thought my dad would not call his bluff, showed back up at the shop a few days later and informed my dad that he also has to move all of the old HVAC units scattered around in the field behind the property, or he would sue my dad for the cost of removal. Now, this too probably had no legal power, since my dad's lease was only on the building, not the field, and my uncle contributed to and used the old units as communal property. But when my dad is pissed off, he is really pissed off. So he agreed to move the old units. He took his tractor over and loaded each one onto his flatbed trailer, drove out behind his barn, and painstakingly arranged hundreds of rust bucket fugly old HVAC units an inch or two off the property line at the back of my uncle's house. Note that my dad could not see these things from his house due to the way his property is set up, but my uncle had an HD view of them in his backyard. My uncle started being even more of a creep than usual, and was always spying on my dad's house, so my dad decided to build a privacy fence down the side of his property that runs along my uncle's property, but not the back of the property where the HVAC units are. The fence guys arrived and worked for a few hours before my uncle came screeching into his driveway and exploded out of his truck, already screaming because these poor fence guys had laid posts or tools or whatever temporarily on his side of the property line as they were building the fence. My uncle called the police, who basically told the fence guys, "Okay dudes, just don't put anything on this crazy man's property," and left. The next day apparently someone left a hammer across the property line, so here comes my uncle screaming at them again. He called the police again, but by the time they got there the guy had already moved his hammer, so the police were just annoyed by this point, but could only warn them not to do it again. Later that afternoon, my uncle called the police a third time, I kid you not. This time he wanted to report that my dad had stolen a backhoe from him. Like one that attaches to the back of a tractor. One that, again I kid you not, my uncle had given to my dad 2 whole years prior, because my uncle didn't even have a tractor big enough to attach the thing to. The cop was not amused when this story came to light, and since it was the same cop who'd been there earlier that day, she was beyond annoyed at that point. My dad helpfully said, "Come get the backhoe, if you want it," knowing full well my uncle had no way to pick the thing up or haul it even the few feet to his own yard. My uncle replied that my dad was just trying to trap him, and would say he was trespassing if my uncle came onto his land, even though the cop was standing right there when my dad offered. And by the way, this conversation was taking place in my dad's driveway. He then said that he wanted to file a complaint with the police that basically amounts to a restraining order against my dad. It isn't a restraining order because it isn't issued by a judge, but the cops treat it that way. It's for habitual trespassers. Annoyed cop helpfully informed my dad that this would mean that even if my uncle texted or emailed him and invited him to come over to his house to discuss things, even if my dad had that written proof he'd been invited, if my uncle called the cops or even took a picture of my dad on his property, he could potentially get arrested for trespassing. My dad said he wanted to file one against his brother too. The pro-revenge part of the story is now upon us. My dad knew full well that his brother had no real clue where the property lines were and was not going to dig up his survey to check. He only knew where the lines were because my dad knows exactly where they are and maintains wooden stubs in the ground periodically along his property lines. So when his brother was away for a few days, my dad moved all of the old HVAC units along the property line over further onto his own property by a few feet and moved the stubs back the same distance. So basically it looked the same as it had before, except it looked like the property line was a few feet further back than it actually is. He then placed some random piece of scrap across the fake property line, still on his own property, but it looked like it was across the property line if all you had to go by were the incorrectly placed stubs, set up a few game cameras aimed at the line and waited. Sure enough, his dumbass brother came storming out of his house as soon as he noticed the scrap on his side of the property line, crossed the real property line to get a good look at the scrap, and called the police. My dad was waiting for them with his survey showing where the actual property line is, a copy of the report annoyed cop had given him, and game camera footage of his brother clearly trespassing on his land, and it was my uncle who got arrested. The only way his revenge for all the trouble and heartache his brother caused could possibly have been any sweeter would have been if it were an annoyed cop who showed up at the scene and arrested my uncle, but alas, he had to make do with someone he and his brother had both gone to high school with, which worked out since it was especially embarrassing for my uncle to be arrested by someone he knew well. And who could make sure everyone else in town knew?